Have you ever cared for something for so long, with such dutiful hands, that you forget to ask yourself why it's sitting in your house at all? That you forget to ask what it truly represents? For 38 years, my Saturday morning ritual was to lift, to polish, to dust a porcelain elephant. It was a wedding gift. And the day I finally saw it, not as an object, but as a message, was the day I understood the entire, silent language of my marriage. Good evening, family. Come, sit with me for a while. This isn't a story of a loud fight or a slammed door. Those stories have their place. My story is about the quiet things. The things we do without thinking. The objects we move around, the traditions we uphold, the small silences we accept, until one day, the cumulative weight of all that quiet becomes a sound only you can hear. It's a story about what we see when our eyes finally adjust to a light that's been dim for decades. It's about the porcelain elephant that wasn't an elephant at all. The receiving of it is a scene I have replayed in my mind more than any other. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was the first stitch in a scene that would come to bind me. A stitch so fine I mistook it for decoration. Our wedding reception was held in the fellowship hall of her church. It smelled of old hymnals and the starched linen on the tables. The air was thick with congratulations that felt like inspections. Robert and I stood together, a little island in a sea of her friends, her family, her world. I was in my cream-colored suit, feeling like a girl playing dress-up. He was so proud, his hand on the small of my back, a steady pressure. And then she moved through the crowd. Eleanor. She did not walk, she processed. She carried it before her, wrapped in tissue paper like something fragile, something sacred. It was not in a box. That is important. A box can be set aside unopened. A box can be forgotten in the flurry. This was presented naked in its intention. She came to a stop before us. The chatter around us dipped into a respectful silence. She did not look at me. She looked at Robert, her son. Her eyes were the color of winter water. She extended her hands. For your new home, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the quiet authority of a judge passing sentence. A strong home needs a strong foundation. She let the tissue paper fall away. And there it was, cream and gold with a howdah on its back painted a garish blue. Its trunk was curved up in that perpetual gesture they say means good luck. It caught the fluorescent light of the hall and seemed to swallow it, shining with a cold, inert glow. It was massive, heavy even to look at. An elephant. It remembers. It will remind you. She placed the cool weight of it directly into my hands. Not Robert's. Mine. I had to accept it or let it fall. My arms sank slightly with the burden of it. Robert let out a soft chuckle of delight. Isn't it magnificent, May? He said it as a statement, not a question. His eyes were on his mother's face, seeking approval. And in that moment I stood there holding this monstrous symbol, my new husband beaming at his mother, a circle closing around me that I had not seen drawn. What could I say? My voice was somewhere far away. It is substantial, I think I whispered. That was the word. Substantial. It was not beautiful. It was not us. We had registered for simple crystal for a set of earthy pottery bowls we saw at a craft fair. This was none of that. This was a declaration, and my thank you sounded thin and insubstantial against the weight of the thing in my arms. Eleanor allowed a small smile, a faint crack in the ice. She gave a single nod. See that it has a place of prominence. Then she turned and was absorbed back into her circle. The moment was over. The music swelled again, but my arms were still full. I carried it through the rest of the reception. I set it on the gift table where it dwarfed the toaster ovens and the linen sets. It did not belong among the other gifts. It was of a different order entirely. A totem. Later, when we piled the gifts into Robert's sedan, he handled it with care, placing it on a blanket in the backseat. He patted it like a pet. Mother has wonderful taste, doesn't she? He said it as we drove to our honeymoon motel. I stared out the window at the passing dark. I felt a strange chill. I told myself I was being silly. Ungrateful even. It was a generous gift. An expensive one. This is what families do. They give heirlooms. They pass on pieces of themselves. I mistook possession for belonging. I mistook weight for value. We arrived at our first little apartment. A railroad flat with windows that shook when the train passed. We unpacked our things, our shared life beginning in boxes of books and records and mismatched plates. And then there was the elephant. Where shall we put it? Robert asked. He said we, but his tone said it already had a home. It needs a proper spot, he said. Somewhere it can be seen. Our mantel was a narrow shelf of painted brick. I suggested the bedroom, perhaps on the dresser. A private thing. He looked almost hurt. But then no one would see it. Mother will want to see it in a place of honor. So we cleared the mantel of the 2 framed wildflowers I had pressed. We moved the little brass clock my own mother had given me. And we centered the elephant. It dominated the small room. Its shadow was long in the afternoon light. It made our few dear things look like shabby afterthoughts. There it is, Robert said with satisfaction. Now it feels like a home. And I remember the specific sensation that followed. It was not anger. It was a subtle hollowing out. A quiet displacement. The first invisible clearing of a space I had thought was mine. I stood beside my new husband in our new home, and I felt the presence of a third person. I felt her taste in the room, her judgment in the placement, her expectation in the very air. The elephant remembered, and it began its work of reminding me. Every morning I would come into the living room and there it would be. That upward trunk like a finger pointing to a heaven of her own design. I would dust around it at first, but dust settled on its back in the intricate grooves of its trappings. It showed neglect. It showed a lack of care. So one Saturday I took a soft cloth. I lifted it. The cool of the glaze seeped into my palms. I wiped it clean. I saw my own faint reflection warped in the curve of its side. And as I set it back down, polishing the spot where it sat with a swirl of my wrist, I performed my first unconscious act of compliance. I was not just cleaning a gift. I was maintaining a shrine. I was a novitiate in a faith I had not chosen. The ritual had begun. That was the true gift. Not the object itself. The gift was the duty, the care, the perpetual acknowledgement. She had given me a vessel, and without a word she had instructed me how to fill it. With my time, with my attention, with my silent acquiescence. And I filled it. For 38 years I filled it. Not knowing that every time I lifted that cloth I was pouring a little bit of myself away. I thought I was building a strong home. I was just learning the geometry of a cage where the walls were polished so smooth you never felt them until you leaned your whole weight against them and found there was no give at all, just your own reflection staring back at you, a woman holding a cloth in a room that never quite became her own. The polishing was never just polishing. It became a kind of meditation, a wrong kind of meditation, where instead of emptying your mind you filled it with the static of someone else's expectations. It started small, as these things do. A habit born of a desire for a clean house, a tidy home. The dust would settle, a fine gray film, on the broad back of the thing, on the intricate carvings of the howdah. It looked sad when it was dusty. It looked neglected. And I could not bear for anything in my home to look neglected. So I would lift it. My hands learned its weight, its balance points, the slight chip on the underside of the base, a flaw hidden from view. The glaze was always cool to the touch, no matter the season. A coldness that never warmed in my hands. I used a special cloth, a soft yellow flannel that came from a bundle of polishing cloths my own mother had given me a lifetime ago for silver. It felt like a small rebellion, using her cloth for Eleanor's elephant. A secret no one knew but me. The ritual was precise. Lift, support, wipe in long smooth strokes from the crown of the head down the curve of the back. Then the careful work around the eyes, the trunk, the delicate edges of the patterned blanket. A circular motion on the flat planes of its sides. Finally I would turn it over, dust the base, and set it back down exactly centered on the faint ring it had worn into the finish of the mantel. Then I would polish that spot too. A final swirl, a completion. This act, this small weekly sacrament, became the quiet drumbeat of my marriage. I polished through conversations that went nowhere. Robert would be reading the paper and I would be dusting the elephant, and I would say perhaps we could take a trip to the mountains this year. A long silence would follow, broken only by the whisper of cloth on porcelain. Then his voice would come from behind the sports section. Mother always said mountain air is too thin for relaxation. And I would nod, though he could not see me. My hand would continue its circular motion. I polished the elephant as my dream of pine trees and quiet trails was buffed into a dull shine of acceptance. I polished through the news of pregnancies from friends, the baby showers I attended with a smile that ached like a muscle held too long. The elephant watched with its blank glass eyes. I would polish it fiercely those days as if I could rub away the hollow feeling inside me. The cloth moving faster, the shine becoming almost aggressive. But the elephant remained, solid, impassive, a monument to the lineage I was apparently failing to produce. Robert never spoke of it. His mother did, just once. She traced the elephant's trunk with a finger and said, "They are matriarchal creatures, you know. The family follows the eldest female. She knows the way." I polished that spot for a month, trying to erase the ghost of her touch. The polishing became my silence. It was the thing I did when I had no words left. When Robert would come home and speak only of his day, of the things his mother had said, of the errands she needed, I would listen and polish. The smooth, predictable motion was a comfort. It was something I could control. The pressure of my hand, the path of the cloth, the resulting shine. It was a tiny kingdom I ruled. A square foot of order. I did not see then that my kingdom was a prison cell and I was merely keeping the bars clean. The ritual was not my solace. It was my sentence. I was serving time, and each Saturday was a mark on a calendar only I could see. I polished through changes in the world outside our window, through hairstyles and hemlines, through presidents and protests. The elephant did not change. It was a constant. It survived moves from that first apartment to the ranch house to the split level where she finally had her own room. It always claimed the prime spot. The first thing unpacked. The anchor. In the new houses, Robert would stand back and say, "Now it looks right. Now it feels like home." And I would begin again the process of wearing a ring into a new mantelpiece. My life measured not in years but in these rings, faint circles on wood or stone, the ghost of the elephant's perpetual presence. I wore my own rings too. A groove in my finger from my wedding band. A groove in my spirit from this other circular motion. There were times I thought of stopping. A wild, fleeting rebellion. I would imagine leaving it to gather dust thick and woolly. I imagined spiders weaving lace from its trunk to the wall. I imagined the shine turning to a matte grief. But I could not do it. The thought alone filled me with a panic that was deeper than habit. It felt like neglecting a duty so fundamental it was like forgetting to breathe. It was not about the object. It was about the order of things. The unspoken contract I had signed with my life. To let it tarnish would be to declare a war one did not have the language to fight. It would be a visible crack in the facade of our life, and I was the one in charge of the facade. So I polished. I polished the elephant the day my father died. I remember the phone call, the drive to my mother's house, the strange quiet of his absence. I came home exhausted, soulsick. Robert offered a stiff hug and said, "You should rest." I went to the living room and I picked up the yellow cloth. I polished that elephant until my arms ached. I cried while I did it, hot silent tears that fell on its back and smeared as I wiped them away. I was not polishing for Eleanor then. I was polishing for me. It was the only gesture I knew how to make in the face of a loss that vast. A familiar motion in a world suddenly unfamiliar. The elephant absorbed my grief and gave nothing back. It just sat shining cold and heavy under my hands. And that is how the cage was built. Not with locks and bars but with ritual. With the gentle, relentless pressure of a weekly duty. With the association of that duty with peace, with order, with being a good wife, with keeping a proper home. The cage was the belief that my care for this object was a virtue. That my dedication to its shine was a reflection of my character. I had internalized the guard. I had become the one who made sure the monument to my own containment was kept spotless. I would look at it gleaming in the lamplight and feel a twisted sense of pride. See how well I care for things. See how I maintain. I did not see the truth. That I was maintaining the very system that held me. I was the curator and the exhibit. The keeper and the captive. Every Saturday I reached for the key of my own cell, not to open it but to polish the lock until it shone. You learn to hear a voice even when no one is speaking. You learn to feel a presence in an empty room. That is the true haunting. It was not that she was always there in the flesh, though she was there often enough. It was that she had become the standard. The blueprint against which every choice, every thought, every preference was measured. Robert was not a puppet on a string. That would be too simple, too kind. He was a man who had lived his entire life within the sound of a certain frequency. Her voice was the background hum of his world, the tuning fork that set the pitch for normalcy, for correctness, for what simply was. And when he married me he brought that frequency into our home like a piece of essential equipment. He did not need to consult her. He carried her consultation within him. It lived in his shrugs, in his sighs, in the way he would say, "Well, you know how mother feels about that." Our home became a place where her taste had tenure. It was not a violent overthrow. It was a quiet academic succession. I would suggest a deep red for an accent wall. He would consider it, then say red is so stimulating. Mother always said earth tones are more restful for a home. And we would end up with a shade of beige that reminded me of dust. I would pick out a couch with soft inviting lines. He would run a hand over the fabric and say, "It seems a bit informal, doesn't it? The one mother has lasted 20 years. And we would choose something upright and durable, covered in a pattern that hid stains and personality with equal efficiency. It was a slow, gentle erosion. A smoothing of my rough edges, my bursts of color, my desires which began to feel less like preferences and more like flaws. Like evidence of a fundamental unseriousness. I learned to pre-edit. Standing in a store holding a throw pillow, I would hear not my own heart but a silent tribunal. Too bright, too bold, too much. I would put it back. I would choose the taupe one. I became proficient in the language of taupe, of oatmeal, of sage, safe serene colors that asked for nothing and gave less. The elephant was the embassy, the permanent diplomatic mission from her country to ours. But her influence was the very air we breathed. Holidays were the clearest liturgy. Thanksgiving was at her table with her china, with her menu that never varied. The turkey was always brined in a specific way, the stuffing was never stuffed but baked in a dish because it was safer. The conversation followed worn paths like grooves in an old record. I would bring a dish, a new sweet potato casserole with a pecan crumble. It would sit barely touched. "Oh, how interesting, dear," she would say. "Robert prefers the traditional marshmallow kind, don't you, Robert?" And he would nod, his mouth full of the familiar mush. My dish would go home with me in its original dish, a monument to my failed understanding of tradition. Christmas was her tree, her ornaments a specific brand of eggnog. New Year's was a quiet affair at home because going out was frivolous. My birthdays were noted with a card from her, a check for a sensible amount. Robert would take me to dinner at the steakhouse she recommended. It was all so polite, so utterly bloodless. There were no fights. There were only corrections. Gentle, firm recalibrations back to the known, the approved, the Eleanor-sanctioned way of being. Our marriage became a committee of three, and I was the minority report that was always filed away unread. Intimacy died not with a bang but with a slow suffocation under a pile of her opinions. In bed after making love, a act that became over time as predictable as the furniture, he would sometimes sigh and say, "Mother always said a firm mattress is the key to a good back." And the spell, whatever fragile magic we had momentarily created, would dissolve. I would stare at the ceiling and see her there in the plaster, a faint watermark of judgment. Our conversations were triangulated. He would share my worries with her, my hopes. He meant well. He was seeking wisdom from the source he trusted most. But I would hear it back from him, filtered through her sensibility. "May is thinking of taking a pottery class. Mother says pottery is such a dusty hobby and you've always had such sensitive sinuses." Or May thought we might volunteer at the animal shelter. "Mother says those places are so depressing and full of germs." It was never a direct no. It was a superior alternative presented as concern. A higher path of wisdom that I simply hadn't considered. My impulses, my curiosities, the small sparks that made me me, were gently diagnosed as problems to be solved. And the solution was always a return to the calm, sterile safety of her worldview. I began to feel like a guest in my own life. A well-meaning but slightly clumsy visitor who never quite learned the house rules. I would set a table and hear her voice in my head about fork placement. I would laugh at a party and then wonder if my laugh was too loud, too unrefined. I folded towels the way she had shown me. I stored groceries according to her system. My own mother's ways, the small comforting chaos of my childhood home, became a distant folk memory, something quaint and slightly embarrassing. I was being refined, polished like the elephant, sanded down until all my rough edges, my grain, my natural pattern was smooth and featureless and acceptably shiny. And Robert was the loving carpenter holding the sandpaper, believing he was helping me become a better piece of furniture. A more fitting addition to the set. The loneliness of it was absolute. It was a loneliness that existed in the very center of a marriage. It is one thing to be alone. It is another to be alone while pressed shoulder to shoulder with someone who cannot see you because he is looking at a ghost over your shoulder. He loved the idea of me. The idea of a wife. A companion for his mother's son. A curator for the life she had envisioned for him. He did not love the messy real woman with her own frequency, her own color palette, her own dreams that did not fit on the mantelpiece next to the porcelain elephant. He loved me as an extension of his obedience. And I loved him for so long. I loved the man I saw glimpses of when the committee was adjourned. The man who could smile at a silly joke, who held my hand in a movie, who wept when his old dog died. But those glimpses became shorter, rarer. The gavel of her influence would always fall, calling the meeting back to order. So I learned the art of silent committee meetings. I would sit with my own thoughts and I would argue my case before the tribunal in my mind. I would plead for the red wall. I would advocate for the pottery class. I would present evidence for a vacation somewhere spontaneous. And I would watch as my own internal voice took on her inflections, her reasonable dismissive tone. I became my own warden. I internalized the third voice until it was my first voice. That is the deepest betrayal. When the cage becomes so familiar you mistake it for the whole sky. When the voice of your confinement is the only voice you hear and you think it is your own conscience speaking. The elephant didn't need to watch me. I was watching myself for it. I was enforcing its rule with a diligence that would have made her proud. The committee was now in permanent session inside my own head, and I was both the troublesome petitioner and the stern silent judge. And the verdict was always the same. Guilty of wanting too much. Guilty of being yourself. Sentence. More polishing. More silence. More beige. Her illness was a long, slow folding inwards. A year of hushed voices in hallways of plastic tubing against parchment skin, of the medicinal smell that seeped into my own clothes. It was my duty. Of course it was. Who else would do it? Robert was helpless, a boy again in the face of this. He would sit by her bed and hold her hand, his face a mask of a pain so deep it had no features. I organized the nurses. I administered the pills. I changed the sheets. I spooned broth past lips that were becoming a thin line. I did it all, not out of love. Love had curdled into something else, a bitter complex sediment of obligation and resentment and a terrible pity. I did it because it was the final and ultimate test of the role I had accepted 38 years before. The good wife, the dutiful daughter-in-law, the strong one, the one who managed things. She would look at me from the canyon of her pillows, her eyes still that winter watercolor, and there was no gratitude there. Only a fierce demanding expectation. As if I were finally performing to specification. As if all those years of polishing had been an apprenticeship for this, the main event. The keeping of her body as I had kept her symbol. The house became a satellite of the sickroom. Our conversations were whispers about medication, about doctors' visits, about the terrible practical poetry of decline. Robert and I moved around each other like ghosts in a shared haunting. Our marriage was the hallway between the living room with its elephant and the bedroom where his mother was dying. There was no space for us. No energy. We were co-executors of a grim estate. Intimacy was unthinkable. Tenderness felt like a violation of the solemn air. We slept back to back, a chasm of cold sheets between us, each listening to the other's wakeful breathing, each alone with a different grief. His was for the looming absence of the sun around which his world had orbited. Mine was for the life I had already lost, the one that was now being buried under a landslide of medical logistics and silent vigils. The funeral was a masterpiece of her own design. She had planned it years before. The hymns, the scripture, the obituary that listed her survivors as her devoted son Robert and his wife May. An appendage. A footnote. I wore a black dress she would have approved of. Conservative. Matronly. I stood beside Robert and accepted the murmured condolences. You were such an angel to her. What a blessing you were. She's at peace now. I nodded and smiled, a small tight smile that felt like a crack in porcelain. I watched Robert. He was pale, shrunken, unmoored. He clung to my arm not for comfort but for ballast. I was the last fixed point in a world that had lost its magnetic north. In that moment I felt a surge of something like hope. It was a tiny fragile green shoot pushing up through the hard frost of that day. It was the thought that now it is over. Now the third voice is silent. Now the committee is adjourned forever. Now perhaps the space she occupied can fill with something of our own making. Something wild and untamed in ours. It was a terrible hope. A selfish one, but it was the only live thing I felt in the entire dry ceremony. We returned to the house. It was heavy with a new kind of quiet. Not the quiet of her absence but the quiet of her overwhelming presence now distilled into memory, into objects, into the very molecules of the air. We did not speak. We moved through the rooms like strangers in a museum after hours. Robert went to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of the whiskey she kept for important occasions. He handed me one. We did not toast. We drank. The fire burned low in the grate. And then his eyes found it. Of course they did. They were drawn to it as they had always been. The elephant sat on the mantel in the fading afternoon light. It had never looked more solid, more permanent. He stared at it for a long time, his jaw working. I watched him. I watched the struggle on his face. The loss, the need for an anchor. And then he spoke. His voice was rough with whiskey and grief. We should keep it right there. In her memory. He did not look at me. He said it to the elephant. A vow. Those 6 words were the second death. The death of that tiny green shoot of hope. It was not the sentiment itself. It was the we. The assumption that my memory was his memory. That my devotion was his devotion. That my mantelpiece was a memorial to a woman whose shadow had been the primary landscape of my life. He did not say let's put it in the attic. He did not say maybe we could find another spot. He did not say what do you think, May. He declared it. A royal decree from the newly crowned king of a hollow kingdom. In her memory, but her memory had never left. It had been the architect of our days. What he meant was in her honor. In her perpetual honor. He was making her a saint and our home her shrine. And I was to remain the caretaker. The silent nun tending the relics. I simply nodded. What else was there to do? To argue would have been to fight a ghost with a man who was more ghost than man in that moment. It would have been a cruelty. But my silence was not agreement. It was the final realization. The understanding that the removal of the person did not dismantle the system. The system was embedded in him. It was coded into his bones. He was the living legacy. The elephant was not a reminder of her. It was a reminder of him. Of his choice. Of his eternal alignment. Her physical absence changed nothing. In fact, it made it worse. Now she was perfect, now she was beyond criticism, now she was memory, and memory is flawless. She could never again say the wrong thing. She was frozen in the amber of his grief forever, right, forever the standard. I would be competing with a perfection that never existed against a ghost who could never err. That night in bed, the chasm between us was no longer just cold sheets. It was geological. It was a continental drift that had been happening for decades, and I had just felt the final seismic separation. He wept in the dark, quiet, shuddering sobs for his mother. I lay beside him, dry-eyed, staring at the ceiling. I did not reach for him. My grief was a different animal. It was not for her. It was for the woman I had been, who had believed that endurance was a virtue, that patience would be rewarded, that after the storm there would be a clearing. My grief was for the understanding that the storm was the climate. And the forecast was eternal polished gray. The funeral had buried 2 things. Her body, and my last foolish hope that my marriage could ever be a partnership of 2. It had always been a monument built for 3. And now, with one of the architects gone, the remaining 2 were just caretakers of a blueprint they had never drawn. He was committed to its preservation. And I, in that moment of silent nodding, felt the last of my commitment turn to ash. It was over, not with a fight but with a recognition. A quiet internal funeral of my own. The yellow cloth was in my hand. My fingers had curled around it of their own accord, a muscle memory so deep it bypassed thought. Saturday morning. The house was silent in a new way. A post-funeral silence thick with dust motes and unsaid things. Robert was upstairs, still asleep or pretending to be asleep, lost in the new geography of his grief. I stood before the mantel. The elephant waited. It expected me. The ritual demanded completion. The circle needed closing. I looked at it. I truly looked at it. Not as a task to be performed, not as a symbol to be decoded, but as a physical object sitting in a beam of sunlight in my living room. The light caught it in a way I had never allowed myself to see. It was not magnificent. It was garish. The gold paint was not gilt, it was cheap brassiness. The blue of the howdah was the blue of a cheap cartoon sky. The trunk curling upward was not a gesture of luck, it was a snarl, a triumphant hook. The eyes, those blank glass eyes, were not wise. They were dead. They were two discs of painted indifference. I saw the chip on its underbelly not as a hidden flaw but as a wound it had sustained in its reign of vulnerability it hid from the world. I saw the layer of wax from decades of polishing a cloudy buildup in the intricate grooves. I had not been preserving it. I had been entombing it under the evidence of my own labor. My hand uncurled. The yellow cloth, a flag of surrender I did not yet understand, fell to the floor. It made no sound. I did not reach to pick it up. I simply stood, and in that standing a lifetime of images began to flood the space behind my eyes, not as memories but as evidence. I saw my young self in the wedding reception dress holding this thing, my arms already aching with the weight of a future I did not consent to. I saw the first apartment, the wildflower prints being removed to make room for this cold centerpiece. I saw 100 Saturday mornings, my reflection warped in its side, a funhouse mirror of the woman I was becoming. I saw Robert's face lit with pride, not for me, not for us, but for his mother's taste, for his mother's approval. I saw the Thanksgivings, the Christmases, the empty spaces at a table where my own family should have been. I saw the ghost of her in every room, her opinion the final word, on color, on fabric, on the very air we breathed. The elephant was not a thing. It was a lens. And looking through it now with my new shattered clarity, I saw the entire distorted landscape of my life. I saw that every time I polished it I was erasing my own fingerprints. I was wiping away any trace that I had been there, that I had touched this life and left a mark. My labor was an act of self-erasure. The shine was the gloss over a void. My void. I saw the cage then. Not as a metaphor but as an architecture. The mantel was its pedestal. The living room its courtyard. The house its walls. The rules of decoration and conduct were its bars. Robert was not my jailer. He was a fellow inmate who loved the walls because they were all he had ever known. He polished them from the inside and called it homebuilding. And I for 38 years had polished alongside him, believing it was partnership. It was collusion. My own hands had smoothed the very bars that held me. The clarity was physical, a cold wash behind my eyes, a settling in my bones. It was not anger. Anger is hot and seeking. This was cold and final. It was the dissolution of a myth. The story I had told myself, the story of duty, of loyalty, of building a strong home, crumbled like old plaster. Underneath was the plain unvarnished truth. I had lived a life in service to a ghost. I had traded my colors for beige, my voice for silence, my desires for a list of correct opinions. I had allowed my worth to be measured by my ability to maintain a shine on a cheap piece of pottery. I looked at my hands resting now empty at my sides. These hands had cooked 1,000 meals she would have approved of. They had folded laundry according to her method. They had waved goodbye as Robert left for another evening at her house. They had held the phone listening to her advice. And they had polished. These hands had become instruments of a will that was not my own. They were strangers to me. When was the last time they had made something, created something, touched something simply for the joy of its texture? They had only maintained, only preserved, only wiped clean. The elephant did not change. It sat there in its beam of light, gleaming with the pathetic shine of my subjugation. It was just a thing. A mass of fired clay and cheap paint. It had no power. The power had been my belief. My belief that it mattered. My belief that tending to it was a sacred duty. My belief that its presence meant something about my home, my marriage, my worth. I had gifted it all that meaning. I had poured 38 years of my life into its hollow belly. And it gave nothing back. It just sat, cold, heavy, ugly. The glaze I saw then was not on the porcelain. It was on my own sight. A cataract of obedience I had let grow over my vision. And in that Saturday morning light with the cloth at my feet it cracked. It peeled away, and I saw the room as it was. Not a home, a museum, a carefully curated museum of a life that had never been lived. A diorama of correct choices. A monument to a woman who was not me. I was the docent, the quiet woman in the corner who knew all the facts about the exhibits but had never lived outside the walls. And Robert, where was he in this new clear light? He was the museum's director, the keeper of the mission statement, the one who believed in the importance of the collection. Our marriage was not a union. It was a curatorship, a shared commitment to the preservation of a past that belonged to someone else. The hope I felt at the funeral, the hope for a new exhibition. For a blank wall, was a fantasy. He wanted the museum to remain open forever, a testament to its founder. He needed me to keep the lights on and the floors clean. I did not touch the elephant. I did not need to. To smash it would have been to acknowledge its power. To move it would have been just another act of curation. I left it there, sitting in its own expectant silence. Let it wait for a polisher who would never come. Let it gather the dust of its own irrelevance. My work was done. The final revelation was this: the cage door had never been locked. It had just been polished so smooth I never thought to push it. All I had to do was stop polishing. And walk away. I turned from the mantel. The room looked different, smaller, fainter, like a stage set after the play has ended. The truth was not a thunderclap. It was a silence so profound it had a sound of its own. It was the sound of a story ending. Not with a period but with a slow releasing breath. I walked out of that room and I did not look back. The elephant could keep its shine. I was going to go find my dust. My beautiful unpolished chaotic real dust. And I would let it settle on me where it may. Leaving was not an action, it was a cessation. It was the final natural consequence of a truth that had finished blooming inside me. There was no list made, no grand plan hatched. I simply turned from the mantel and walked up the stairs. The steps did not creak under my weight, they sighed as if they had been waiting for this. I went to the closet, not the big one we shared but the small one at the end of the hall where extra blankets were stored, and on the high shelf sat my old suitcase. The one from before, a soft-sided bag the color of faded moss. I had to stand on a chair to reach it. Dust rained down in a soft cloud smelling of cedar and thyme. I did not brush it off. I let the dust remain. It felt like a blessing. I carried the suitcase not to the master bedroom but to the guest room. Her room. It was pristine, untouched since the nurses had stripped the bed. It smelled of lemons and emptiness. I set the bag on the quilt. She had chosen a geometric pattern in shades of gray and beige. And I began to pack. But not for a trip. I was not running to something. I was leaving from something. The distinction lived in my hands. I did not pack for a climate or an occasion. I packed for a feeling. I packed the sweater that felt like a hug, the trousers that moved with me, the simple cotton dress the color of a stormy sea that Robert had said was too plain. I packed my own mother's thin silver bracelet. I packed the book of poetry from my college days, its pages soft as skin. I packed the sketchpad blank for 20 years and a single charcoal pencil. I packed my own pillowcase. I packed for comfort, for solace, for the possibility of a self I had long ago placed in storage. Every item I folded and placed in the bag was a quiet repatriation. It was not about taking things. It was about reclaiming echoes. The sound of my own taste. The texture of my own choice. The suitcase filled not with belongings but with evidences of a person who had once existed. It was a modest collection. It did not even fill the bag. A life distilled into one suitcase of truths. The rest of it, the furniture, the dishes, the correct art on the walls, the entire museum, that was not mine. It was the set dressing for a play I had stopped agreeing to perform in. Let it stay. Let him have the complete collection. Downstairs I could hear him stirring. The groan of the plumbing, the shuffle of his slippers on the kitchen tile. The sounds of a man moving through a familiar space, unaware that the axis of that space had just permanently shifted. I did not hurry. Zipping the bag was a sound both final and gentle. A whispered period. I changed my clothes. I took off the Saturday morning sweats. I put on the sea-colored dress. I looked at myself in the mirror of her vanity. The woman who looked back was unfamiliar. Her eyes were older but clearer than they had been in years. There were no tears. Her face was a calm shore after a hurricane has passed. She looked like someone I could get to know. I did not write a note. What would it have said? Words had failed us for decades. A note would be a distraction, an invitation to a conversation that could not happen. He would want to discuss it, to reason it out, to form a committee. There was no committee left. The final vote had been cast in silence. I picked up the suitcase. It was light, astonishingly light. I carried it downstairs. He was in the kitchen pouring coffee into her good china cup. He turned and saw me. His eyes took in the suitcase, the dress, the expression on my face which must have been utterly alien to him. A peaceful resolve. May, he said. His voice was morning rough tinged with confusion. Where are you going? I did not answer immediately. I set the suitcase down by the front door. I walked to the hall table, the one where the mail accumulated. I took my house key from my key ring. It made a soft metallic click as it separated from the loop. I placed it on the polished wood. It looked small and insignificant there. A tiny piece of shaped metal surrendering its authority. I am leaving, Robert. I said it the way I might have said it is raining. A simple observable fact. Not a threat, not a negotiation. A statement of weather. His confusion deepened, furrowing his brow. Leaving? What do you mean? Is this about Mother? About the... He glanced toward the living room, toward the elephant. He could not even say it. Is this about the elephant? You can move it if you want. We can put it in the study. And there it was. The entirety of our misunderstanding in one sentence. You can move it. We can put it in the study. As if the problem was location. As if the problem was the object itself and not the 38 years of what it represented. As if a change of venue would change the constitution of our lives. He saw a thing to be relocated. I saw a prison I had already walked out of. I did not explain. He would not have heard it. His language was made of objects and actions. Mine was now made of silence and space. I looked at him not with anger but with a kind of weary compassion. He was a man standing in a house that was about to become a tomb, and he did not even know he was the one living in it. Goodbye, Robert, the first said. I picked up the suitcase. I opened the front door. The morning light flooded in fresh and new. It was an ordinary Saturday. Birds were arguing in the oak tree. A lawnmower hummed in the distance. The world was going on. I stepped over the threshold. I did not look back at him standing there in the dim foyer holding his mother's china cup. I did not look back at the living room, at the mantel, at the gleam of the porcelain elephant in the shadows. I closed the door behind me. Not a slam. A soft but definitive click. The sound of a lid closing on a box I no longer needed to carry. The air outside was different. It had weight and scent. It was full of the green smell of cut grass and distant rain. I put the suitcase in the trunk of my car. I got in. I sat for a moment, hands on the wheel. I felt the stillness of the house at my back, a stagnant pond. I felt the road before me, a river. I started the engine. The familiar vibration was a hum of possibility. I did not drive away in a rush. I pulled out slowly, carefully, as if not to wake the sleeping street. I drove toward the ocean. I had no plan beyond that. I needed to see something that owed nothing to anyone. Something that could not be polished or curated or placed on a mantel. Something vast and untamed and older than all our little sorrows. The further I drove, the lighter I felt. Not happy, not free yet, but unburdened. The suitcase in the trunk was all I had chosen. The rest of it, the entire carefully constructed life, was receding in the rearview mirror, becoming small, becoming silent, becoming a diorama in a museum I had resigned from. He called, of course. My phone vibrated on the passenger seat. I saw his name illuminated on the screen. I let it ring. The sound was a tiny frantic bell ringing in a room I had already left. It went to silence. Then it rang again, and again. The sound of a man poking a bell in an empty house, wondering why the echo was so hollow. I did not answer. There were no words left. My action was my final statement. Any conversation would be him trying to translate my silence back into his language of objects and compromises. I would not be translated. I would remain in my own quiet country. I arrived at the coast as the afternoon was softening into evening. I checked into a small inn, not a grand hotel. A white clapboard place with a rocking chair on the porch and the sound of the waves as its only music. The room was simple. A bed, a desk, a window. It was blank. It held no history, no expectations. It was a room waiting for a story to be written in it. I placed my suitcase on the luggage stand. I took out my own pillowcase and put it on the pillow. A small familiar territory in a new land. I walked to the window and looked out. The ocean was there, gray and endless, moving with a rhythm that had nothing to do with me. It was glorious. I stood and watched it until the last light faded from the sky. The elephant was gone, not from the mantel where it surely still sat, but from my mind. Its weight, its shine, its demanding presence had evaporated. In its place was this roar, this salt scent, this boundless horizon. He called again later. His voice on the voicemail was different. Thinner, breathy with a new panic. May, please. The house is so quiet. It's too quiet. The elephant, it just sits there. I listened to his message standing at the window in the dark. The waves were a constant sigh. I finally understood his silence all those years. It wasn't that he had nothing to say to me. It was that he had been speaking to her. And now she was gone. And I was gone. And he was alone in a quiet of his own making. He was left with the artifact. The symbol. The shining weight of his obedience. And the silence was deafening. I did not call back. I deleted the message. I had given 38 years of my silence to that house. Now the silence was mine. And it was not empty. It was full of the sound of my own breath. Full of the ocean. Full of a future uncharted and my own. I had not broken a single thing. I had simply laid down the cloth. I had left the elephant in its own dust. And I had walked away without a sound into a world that was beautifully, loudly, imperfectly, and finally my own.